Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So, you work for Rouleur. What does your day-to-day look like as a writer?
So, I guess my day to day, it changes. It's actually such a varied job, which is quite one of the things I really like about it. But it depends on the time of year because in the season, which runs from March till September, we're really busy covering races. If a race like the Tour de France is on, I get to start my day a bit later because really the work starts when the stage finishes. So that's normally about 4 or 5 o'clock, and then kind of working into the evening, writing analysis about the race and what's happened. And then if there's no racing on, I might have some interviews set up with riders, chat to them about their plans, and not just riders, even people kind of within the sport, photographers, anyone with an interesting story really. Just chat to them about what they're doing, and next day I'll probably be transcribing that interview, writing it up, publishing on the website, or sending it to the editor of the magazine and letting him go through it and then put it in the magazine. So it really does vary. And obviously we've also got a lot of events as well that we do. So sometimes I'm preparing to host talks on stage for that. It's a really varied job, but it's really fun. Yeah, doing a bit of everything, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what would you say your job title is?
I think officially my job title is staff writer, but at Rouleur we're quite a small team, so it's one of those companies where everyone kind of mucks in, like I end up doing a bit of social media and I'll help a bit with the events and organising them, which I like, but staff writer is kind of official title.
It's cool to work for a magazine that isn't just a magazine. They do events, they're actually at the races, they're being very much on the ground as well as writing things up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're kind of, I guess you could say, like a multimedia platform in that we've got events like Rouleur Live, which is in November every year, and that brings together some of like the biggest names in the sport from the men's and women's side to go on stage, talk about their careers and the season. And it's like one of the few opportunities you get that cycling fans get to meet them and mingle with them. Like you can be in the kind of show having a drink and suddenly, Demi Vollering will walk past you or something like that. And it's a really cool event. So we do stuff like that. And then we've also got our podcast. But I think like our tagline is inside the peloton. So it's important for us to be on the ground at races, as that's where you really get the insight and you really get to chat to people and, hear about them and get to know the riders. I think we're always trying to look for kind of different angles and talk to the riders and get to know something about them that maybe we didn't know just from watching them race. We really want to try and find out who the people are behind the helmets and the glasses, and get an insight into what makes them tick as people, and rather than just seeing them as racers, which I think is quite easy to do in cycling because it can feel like they're quite separated from you, like hidden behind all the kit and they're just racing, and then they're gone and you don't really hear about them. So we're all about trying to chat to them and get a little bit more insight into the kind of people they are as well.
And how did you enter the creative industry?
My story is a bit of a weird one, actually. So I loved writing throughout, my whole childhood. I was always reading. And I always thought I'd be one of the people who would definitely go to university because I've always loved studying, and I really liked exams, which all my friends thought was a bit weird, but I never really had a problem with them. And but then I got into cycling when I was about 11, my local track, which is Herne Hill Velodrome. My dad took me down there for a session and I really liked it. And as I was doing my A-levels and my GCSEs, I was getting more and more into it, and I was part of the British cycling programme for a little while. And then it kind of came to that decision moment where I had to say, what do I do? If I go to university, it probably means sacrificing my dreams of becoming a cyclist and doing it as a career. So I made the call to go to Belgium actually and try and pursue being a professional cyclist. And I was there for 3 seasons. Then COVID hit. So it was like all the races were cancelled and I had to come back home for a while. That gave me some time to think. And I was about to leave the under 23 category. So I kind of needed to either step up to a team that was paying me a livable wage. Fortunately, in women's cycling, it's still really hard to get paid to do cycling as a job unless you're in one of the top teams in a world tour team. So I was using Dave Rayner funding and the money I earned from doing a job in the winter to fund it, but it wasn't really sustainable. So I was like, right, I'm going to have a gap year and then I'm going to go to university and do it as like a mature student. I knew the former editor of Rouleur. He said to me, oh, we're looking for a customer service person at Rouleur. He said to me, you know, if you ever want to try writing, we've got a jersey you can review. I thought, oh, well, I've always liked writing, I'll give it a go. I wrote the review of this jersey and he said it was good. And then it just kind of spiraled, kind of taught me showed me the ropes, gave me really big interviews to do. Like I interviewed Anna Van Der Breggen in my first year of writing and did the cover story for the magazine, which was amazing opportunities. Eventually, they took the customer service off me, which I was quite grateful for, and then could just go straight into writing. I guess it's quite unusual. I haven't got any proper journalism qualifications or anything, but I was thrown in at the deep end and luckily learnt to swim.
Funny, isn't it? Because for a career like journalism, you'd say you need to go to university, get your degree, get a master's and go straight into a programme. And you were a cyclist and now you work for a cycling magazine, which means that you actually understand what it is to be a cyclist, and arguably it's given you an advantage.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much pressure on younger people to go to university, and it's taught that it's the only pathway you can take if you want a career that's successful. I think there's no harm like going on a different path. I've learned from actually being out in the world and actually learned probably more than I would if I'd have been at university. I grew up racing a lot of riders who have now made it to the World Tour ranks. So I'm now in this position where I've got a lot of contacts and I know what they want to ask. I know what's going to probably annoy them after a race, but I also know what's going to get the best, insight out of them about how the race has gone. And that's really helpful and something I think is hard to learn if you've never kind of been in the bunch yourself. Those years in Belgium were really, really valuable to me and I think have definitely helped me in my career now.
And that gives you such a more familiar way of writing, I guess, as well, rather than just the standard answers that they'll give you. They'll open up a bit more and you'll get a lot more insightful information from them, and you'll be able to put that in a way that gives you Rouleur like a USP in your articles.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That is what we're trying to do, is have that USP and try and show a different side to these riders. And that definitely helps if they're comfortable with you and they open up to you. I mean, that's so much, of interviewing people is about that, trying to build a rapport with someone and make them feel like they can open up to you. So it's super useful knowing the riders and kind of understanding to an extent what they're going through and what their day-to-day life looks like already.
And what's the favourite story that you've ever written?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the interview I did with Anna Van Der Breggen when she announced she was retiring and she came to London and she came to Rouleur Live and I got to spend a whole morning with her. We chatted for ages. It didn't really feel like an interview. It was just like really getting to know her. We did a photo shoot with her. She spent like 2 days here and that was the biggest kind of interview I've ever been given to write. She ended up being on the cover of the magazine and it was a bit of pressure, to be honest, because I hadn't done anything kind of that big before. But I actually have got like a printout of the cover on my wall at home, and I'm super proud of doing that. So I'd say that was one of my favorite ones, and I think that was where I really learned that don't go into an interview, with your questions prepped and really stick to them. You've got to try and get to know the person and let them speak, give them time to open up to you, because otherwise, if they start feeling like you're, interrogating them or something, that's when they kind of close off. So that's what, I learned with that interview, to just treat them like real people as well. She was Anna Van Der Breggen. I'd watched her be the best female cyclist in the world growing up. And then I was interviewing her and I was like, having to force myself not to panic, just like, she's just a normal person, don't freak out, like just treat her normally. So that's probably one of my favorites, and that was quite a few years ago now. So I guess more recently I did an interview with Victoria Pendleton as well, for the magazine, just a couple of months ago actually, about her leaving the sport and why she decided to retire when she did. And she spoke a lot about kind of the mental health issues she's had and the strain it has on your mental health to be an athlete, and how she retired not because she felt like she was physically done, but because mentally it was too much of a challenge. And she really opened up to me about how she was treated in the British cycling system and things like that. So it's always those interviews that you feel like you've really got to know someone, I think, and they've really opened up to you, that end up being my favorite ones.
Yeah, because you're not just talking about racing, you're talking about who they are as people. And with a sport, any elite sport, but a sport like cycling, there's not just a physical aspect to it, but there's the mental aspect, there's the mental health element and the pressure of it. And I guess with women's sport, because there are less races, and until recently there would be a lot less press at it, you have less chances, so therefore there's more pressure to win.
Yeah, I think there's a definite shift the last couple of years, like you say, where there has been press at their races. So whereas the men are used to kind of batting journalists off who want to ask them questions, the female riders tend to give you a lot more time, actually, which is really nice. And I think they're quite still at the point in the sport where they're quite appreciative to have people giving them that coverage. Recently at the Tour de France, it was the final stage. I mean, there was so many journalists there. When I went to the women's Paris-Roubaix for the first edition of it 2 years ago, I think I was one of 2 female journalists there. So I'm really happy to see like more and more journalists come and cover the sport.
The sport getting more and more elite, which is what women's sport definitely needs. Going back to the interview question, do you have a go-to interview question?
I don't know, like I try and avoid the stereotypical question, how's your season been so far? That's basically what I would go to be honest. It is a way to open up the conversation, but yeah, I try and avoid the ones where they sort of will roll their eyes and think, oh my god, another question about that. I just ask, like, genuinely just ask them, what have you done today, like how's your day going, just to try and bring it a bit back to normality and like have a normal chat with them before you start going into the straight, how did you feel about this race, and the sort of more intense questions. It also depends on like how much time you have with the rider. I spoke to Mathieu Van Der Poel for a magazine feature not long ago, and I think they gave me like 10 minutes with him. So in that scenario, I'm like, oh, I need to get straight to it, to be honest. I don't have time for small talk, really.
How was interviewing Mathieu Van Der Poel?
It's okay. Yeah, he's very like blunt and kind of straight talking. He doesn't have like he didn't with me have a massive sense of humor. Like, one of the questions I asked him was what was his least favorite thing about cycling, and he replied, the media. So that kind of threw me a bit, because I was like, oh, I am the media. And then he kind of started laughing, and I was like, oh, I didn't really know if we were joking or not. I just sort of laughed it off. But
the nervous laugh.
Like, I mean, yeah, exactly, the awkward laugh. But 10 minutes with a rider, it's pretty hard to really find out a lot about them, and about it's what it is. He's a superstar. So,
oh goodness, yeah, 10 minutes is not long to be able to say all of your questions. You always need to psych yourself up. Like, you're going for an interval session, you're like, right, here we go.
Exactly.
And when you're writing an article, how do you balance creating an interesting story title while avoiding the cliche of clickbait?
Oh, it's a difficult one. That is one of the main challenges, especially with website writing, because in the magazine, you know, people are subscribed anyway, so they like your content, and they're going to receive the magazine. So that's the kind of good thing about subscription model and people getting the magazine. But with website stuff, you really need it to stand out amongst the noise on like Twitter, on Instagram, where you're sharing your articles. So I think I always try and not think of it as clickbait, but I read through the interview and I think, well, what is the hook here? What will people find interesting? What have I found out in this interview that people didn't know about this rider before? I'm always trying to avoid the, Mathieu Van Der Poel says he wants to win cyclocross worlds, because, it's so obvious. I'm sort of more trying to find a little bit of a different angle and think, okay, well, what did Mathieu Van Der Poel tell me then that he might not have told anyone else, or that is, and I'll try and pull that thing out. And yeah, at Rouleur, we're not really about that. We're really trying to give a bit more of an in-depth insight into who the riders are. And I think a lot of people that read our content are readers who want to sit down for a couple of minutes and really get into a story, rather than looking for those short sound bites, which you can probably find on other news websites elsewhere.
And Rouleur are doing a lot of online media stories as well as doing your hard copy magazine. Have you seen a decrease in sales of the paper magazine as you've increased the online media?
I think we've definitely seen it sort of levelling slightly compared to the growth we've seen in years before. But we have launched an online subscription service via our new app, which is really being really successful for us. And I think that's the way we maybe see our content going. Like, we really believe there'll always be a place for print media. I love getting a magazine through the door, opening the pages. There's something so special about it. But at the same time, we are aware of how the media landscape is changing. So we know that digital content is the way forward. But at the same time, the reality of it is that content online does need to be monetized in some way, and we'd rather not monetize it by putting adverts everywhere, but by saying to people, if you support our journalism, we can keep it independent, we can keep doing what we love, and just for like price of a coffee, you can support our web coverage. So I don't think it's replacing the print media in any way, but it's just for people who want to read online. Then we give them that option through the digital edition, through our app, and through the stories we produce online. And yeah, it's interesting because I think we're seeing a lot more and more kind of websites put up paywalls across news in all industries are doing that. So that's definitely the way I think the media landscape is going online. We don't see that as replacing print at all. I think there'll always be a place for print. Our magazine is a really beautiful coffee table magazine, and I think people will always want that.
And how has social media impacted journalism?
I think on the one hand, like we were talking about earlier, it's kind of made a bit more space for clickbaity articles that kind of do stand out and have something that makes people stop scrolling. So I guess that's one impact, is that you have to make headlines more attention grabbing. But what is changing is that now a lot of the teams in cycling are producing their own content. So write their own articles about the riders, and they'll be able to kind of shape the narrative of the story they want to tell about their team. And that's, I think, the danger zone for journalism, is when the teams are not giving us as much access to the riders to write stuff about the team independently, and they're creating their own sort of content through websites, YouTube, social media. And that's kind of filling the void of people want to see about their kind of insight into their riders. But at the same time, that's obviously coming from the teams. It's not impartial. So I think with COVID as well, the access to teams went down quite a lot, because obviously they couldn't really do face-to-face interviews, and at races, everything moved online. Press conferences were massively reduced in length, and they weren't done in person. So it's slowly moving back to how it was before COVID, but I still think that teams are limiting access for press quite a lot, which is making it harder to get interviews. And I think something that a lot of journalists are hoping we don't move further towards, because it's really important that we can keep producing independent coverage, and I think social media is giving the teams and themselves more of the platform to tell their stories, which is good in some ways, but at the same time means that the coverage we do is also needs to be there to show an impartial view of topics.
Definitely a balancing act, that with the new social media platforms developing, it is something that everyone needs to be aware of, and there's no norm. I guess it's constantly developing. And with the short form video content changing and arguably limiting people's attention spans, do you find this affects what articles people are interacting with most for Rouleur, and the length of article that people are interacting with?
I think we kind of are trying to balance both. I mean, we're fully aware that, the average read times on articles are going down, as, like you say, things like TikTok and stuff are coming through and people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. But we really think we've got kind of quite an engaged audience who will read our content because they like what Rouleur does, and what Rouleur does best is kind of long form pieces that give a different angle and also talk about the culture of the races and what the cycling culture and what it is. So we still see that people want to read that stuff, but I think we're also balancing it out with more sort of reactive, quick content. So we try and balance a bit of both, really.
You've just come back from the Tour de France Femme. How was it?
It was great. Yeah, it was so much fun. I loved covering it on the ground. It's like I went last year as well to the first one, so I wasn't quite sure how it would change this year, because obviously last year, with it being the first one, there was so many fans and quite a lot of hype around the race. So it was a real test to see, like, was that hype just because it was the first time, or is that going to continue? And also the women's race didn't start in Paris this year. Last year it did, and it grew back onto the end of the men's race finishing in Paris, whereas this time it had its own standalone start. So it was a real test of like, are we going to get the same interaction, the same fans? But I was completely blown away actually by how many people had come out to support the race. And it was really, really amazing race to cover. Some really great storylines in the racing as well. And I think differences between the top riders are getting smaller and smaller. And that's really showing that the strength and depth and the growth of the peloton is happening really quickly. And that's making it better racing to watch. I mean, more and more riders are being paid a livable wage, which means they can train full time, and that therefore raises the level of the entire peloton. So if we can still keep progressing in that direction, I think the future is really bright. It's easy to forget what a young sport women's cycling is compared to the men's side, and how it's still growing, it's still building its own like narrative and structure.
It's so true that we forget how young women's cycling actually is. I mean, you're talking about just before lockdown that you weren't being paid a wage enough, that you had to then work on the side of it, which meant that you couldn't train full time. So how are you supposed to match the level of the top women cyclists who are paid to work and cycle full time. How do you make that jump up? It's such a catch-22 situation. Minimum wage for World Tour being introduced, it is such a progression that there is, and it is little steps. You know, you're like, yes, women get maternity pay, you know, which is wild that we're celebrating something that is quite basic working right in the world outside women's sport.
Exactly. I think where the next steps need to be taken is a lot of the, you know, the minimum wage to World Tour riders that we're talking about. It's really good for the riders at the very top, equal prize money, really good for the riders who are winning. But what I experienced firsthand and what I think needs more development is the, you know, the bottom level. There's still no minimum wage for UCI continental teams. And I think, I mean, at the Tour de France, there was, I think, a survey from the Cyclist Alliance showed around 30% of the peloton still will be working another job to supplement their cycling. I mean, that's in the biggest race in the world. It's pretty crazy statistic. So
the Tour de France had their longest race ever in one of the stages. Was it 180 kilometers, the longest women's race? What do you think about that?
Yeah, they did. Yeah. I think it was good for the one stage in the Tour de France. I think, you know, it was like you have a stage for the climbers or a stage for the sprinters. You had a stage for the riders who really like long races. That was great. Maybe when the women's peloton, you know, when the strength in depth is there a bit more, when there's more women on the level to be training those sort of distances, having the support to know how to manage those sort of distances as well, because there's so much to learn in terms of nutrition, training techniques, how to train for back-to-back days of racing that distance. So much of the peloton don't yet have access to that I think it might just highlight that discrepancy more than is needed to create good racing. So I think it was nice that they had it and good for this year, but I definitely don't think we're at the point yet where we need to see that back-to-back, you know, happening every race yet. But maybe one day, just not yet.
I think that's such an interesting point, actually, that it could highlight the discrepancy between those lower teams and the higher teams based on resources and available knowledge. I guess it's the balance of, is it a performance or is it a sport? Are we doing it for the broadcasting, or are we doing it for the sportsmanship, the endurance, the challenge of it? And then I guess if you just go based on the sport, then you might not get all of the people tuning in, which means it's not broadcasting, and you have that vicious cycle. A few years ago, you couldn't even watch women's cycling. You don't want to make it into something that people won't actually interact with.
Exactly. And I think, you know, the reality is that the sponsors pay for the views of their logos. So it is about the fans, really. Realistically, the sport needs fans to survive. That's why sponsors put their money into it. So I do think thinking about what's viewer friendly is really important and something that should be at the forefront of everyone's minds, really. It's the same with teams producing, like I was talking about, their own content. It's all for the fans. It's trying to get fan engagement, and then from that you get more sponsors putting more money in. That's the reality of it. Whether it's better for the sport or not, I think the focus does have to be on what's good to watch, really.
And what was your highlight of the Tour de France then?
Well, actually, I had quite a fun experience because I went on the back of a race motorbike. In the convoy, they've got team cars, and then they have race motorbikes as well. And I was just sitting in the press room where we sit and write our articles at the end of every stage. And the woman from ASO who organised the Tour de France, she came up to me and said, "Oh, we've got like spare space in this motorbike." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, should I say yes?" But immediately I was like, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it." And then the next morning I was walking up to this motorbike, like, what have I done? I was really regretting it because I thought this is going to be so scary.
It's terrifying. Like, genuinely, in a team car, you're just like, I feel like I need to wear a helmet. I cannot imagine what it's like on the back of one of those motorbikes.
I know, and got to the kind of guy who was going to be driving me around, and I'd get a bit of reassurance out of him. But I don't really speak any French. He didn't speak any English, so just sort of communicating via like our Google Translate apps. And then I say to him like, "Oh, so have you been doing this a long time?" You know, thinking he'd say, "Yeah, like done it for 10 years." He goes, "Oh no, this is my first tour," and I was like, "Oh, that doesn't help me anymore." But then, when I got on it and we got going, it was so much fun. It was like being on a roller coaster for like 4 hours. I loved it. It was a bit sketchy in places. We had to do this, you know, you're in the convoy at the back, and then to get in front of the race, you basically have to go through the peloton. So the lead commissaire, he'll call you through when it's safe to get past them. He called us through, and at times I was like, how has he called us through now? You know, we were kind of shoulder to shoulder with the riders who are so vulnerable compared to a big motorbike. And I kept saying to the driver, like, just back out, you know, we can't fit through. And he was beeping them through, and, you know, they're racing, they didn't care. And I was kind of conflicted at the end. I was like, well, that was super fun, but at the same time, I not sure how safe that was, and I'm not sure how I feel about, you know, the motorbikes going through the peloton like that. I was sort of a bit, almost felt guilty for enjoying myself, because at the same time I felt like we were posing quite a lot of risk to the riders. So I came away with some like kind of conflicted thoughts, but it was really interesting. Yeah.
It's so controversial, isn't it? The motorbikes in the peloton, the end of the men's tour, when the motorbike was going up and blocked Pogacar's attack. It was quite a controversial topic. Like, would he have made it? Would he have made up time? He probably wouldn't have won the tour from it. But when they obstruct the racing, and you do remember how vulnerable the cyclists are on their bike against a however heavy motorbike flying past them.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult one, because I understand that like we need the coverage and you need the TV motorbikes in there, and photographers, like, I want to get my interviews at the end of the day. Photographers want to get their photos and people to buy their photos. So I completely understand it, but yeah, it's a really difficult one. I think maybe it needs to be measured a bit more, like how many motorbikes you can have in the race. Because I mean, did I really need to be on one in the race? Probably not. Like, I'm glad I got the chance, but maybe it needs to be monitored a bit more, how many of them there are and if it's completely necessary, because it is a real danger of the sport. I mean, the seeing the riders getting back to the bunch, if they'd stop to go to the toilet or stop to they had a puncture and had to stop by the side of the road. I was watching the speed they go to get back into the peloton, and it was just like mind-blowing that there were then moving vehicles next to them as well. And you sort of take a moment, you think, in what other sport in the world would this be okay?
Yeah, cycling's so unusual to other sports. If you're watching Wimbledon, you're nowhere near the tennis players, and then you can literally be up at the top of a mountain with the best cyclists in the entire world, like less than a meter away from you.
It's so amazing when, you know, there's walls of fans. Like when the women's peloton went up the Tourmalet, which is like, you know, one of the most iconic climbs of the Tour de France, fans were lining the road, they were cheering them on, and you kind of want to say like, oh, step back, but then that's also what makes it so magical, I think. So I don't know, like, I wouldn't want to see necessarily more control or the fans all barrier it in, but at the same time, the safety of the riders and their racing has to be at the priority of everything.
So you watch the stage, you do your interview, and then you've got to write up your stage report in like a few hours. How, amid the chaos of the Tour de France, can you get into the writing zone?
Well, it's kind of okay. I think hectic bit, which is actually probably my favourite part, because it's kind of, you get a bit of adrenaline, is when you see the riders come in and there's like this scrum to get your microphone near them and get a question to them. And so you kind of do that for like an hour, and then you go back to the press room. So it's what like the organisers put on for the journalists. It's normally in a big sports hall, and they lay out loads of desks and plastic chairs, and they have TVs where they're playing the race. And then in there, it's kind of like being in a library or something. Like, it's actually really studious and everyone's getting on with their work. So it's more like, you feel, if you're like on your phone scrolling TikTok or something, you feel a bit like, oh, everyone's looking at me, I'm not actually doing my work. So yeah, in that environment, it's actually quite easy to focus, but it just depends on when the race finishes. Like, for example, when they went up the Tourmalet, I think the organisers were trying to get primetime TV coverage for that stage. So they didn't start till 4:00 and they didn't finish till 7:30. We were on the top of this mountain, needed to get down and start work. I don't think I started writing till like 10:00 that night, and then I was working till like 2 a.m. So yeah, it's pretty hard when you're tired to kind of get your mind in that writing focus, but you just got to force yourself, really. You can't publish the story the next day because the interest is gone. It's so timely when you're covering the tour like that. So I just try and put my phone on the other side of the room and force myself to focus. It's like all you can do. It's while you're there, you have to get the job done. So it is tricky, but yeah, it's one of the hard parts of the job, really, is trying to get your mind away from all the excitement of like being with all the fans and stuff, and thinking, right, okay, let's try and break this race down and what actually happened. Especially when a lot of the times when you're actually covering the race, you don't even get to watch the finish. So you kind of, if you're lucky enough to have signal, you can watch it on your phone. You just have to kind of guess, quickly look on Twitter what had happened before you ask them the questions, because yeah, a lot of the time you've actually missed the finish as well. So it's tricky. It is tricky.
And with the development of women's cycling and the amazing Tour de France and all of the other races that the women's calendar now includes, how has Rouleur's focus and approach to women's cycling changed?
Massively, it really has. I mean, 2 years ago, we published our first ever women's issue, which was guest edited by Orla Chenoweth, who's a amazing broadcaster and journalist. She works for Eurosport. It was just before I actually joined the company. She guest edited that, so I kind of came in at this time where it felt like a massive momentum was building for women's cycling. It was our best-selling issue in history. It broke records, got us so many subscribers, and with that, there was kind of a commitment from Rouleur to change how we do things, to always make sure there was parity in the magazine between male and female coverage, to do more on our website. And it was sort of a promise to our readers and to everyone who was invested in Rouleur that we would change our approach to women's cycling and give it the attention it deserved. And since then, we've done more and more on our website. Make sure we cover every single women's world tour race. We had two of us on the ground at the Tour de France Femme, and coming up we've got our second women's issue, which it feels like it's the right time for it, because we're seeing this massive growth and massive interest in women's cycling. So we're doing a women's issue, and it's not to say that this is the only time we cover women's cycling, not at all, but it's kind of to readdress the balance of that. For so many years we only ever have seen reports on men's cycling, so we're trying to redress that balance by giving a platform to the women and telling stories that are not only about professional racing but are for women in general. Like in this magazine, there's advice about training through your menstrual cycle, there's things, just things for women who don't need to be professional cyclists but just like riding a bike. There's articles about commuting, for the average person who wants to commute and uses their bike for that. It's not all about the pro racing. And I think that's really important as well, to grow women's participation and make it feel like it's a space where women belong as well. Is you don't always have to wear lycra, you don't always have to spend hundreds of pounds on your bike or your kit. You can be a cyclist because it's how you want to get around, it's how you want to get from A to B. And the upcoming women's issue, I think it's really another step change in our coverage. Basically put together like an editorial panel. So we picked 6 women from really influential parts of cycling to advise us basically on what they want to see and what they think that has been rejected from cycling media for a long time. And one of the women on that panel was a TikTok sensation. She's called Sydney Cassidy, known as Sid Grows, and she makes videos in the gym about empowering women. She's got millions of subscribers, and she was on there and she gave us an insight of the younger generation, which I think Rouleur maybe hasn't appealed to in the past, of what they might want to read. We had Isla Roundtree, who's the founder of Isla Bikes, who make children's bikes, and she was raising things about how componentry sizes in cycling, so like the sizes of brake levers, for example, are designed for men's hands. So immediately when a woman gets on a bike, she might feel like she doesn't have as much control on her brake levers because they're not designed for smaller hands. And Lizzie Deignan was on the panel as well. She spoke about paternity leave in men's cycling and how it's crazy that her husband, when he was a professional cyclist, wouldn't have got the time off to be with his child. He could have been sent to a race the next day. There was no infrastructure to give paternity leave. So there was so many interesting topics. And it's also not just a magazine for women, it's a magazine for everyone. The stories in it are shaped by women, but it's stuff that's relevant to men and women. And I think for the change to actually happen that we want to see, we do need, men and women to be on board with it. We need male allies and people who will support the movement. And that's what we're trying to do with this issue. And we're trying to do with Rouleur's coverage in general, is try and spread the message that, look, if you take it out of your mind that these are women's races and you just watch them completely from an impartial view, the racing is as good and it is as exciting. And so that's why we try and treat women's racing the same as we would men's, the same coverage, the same criticism as well. I think that's really important, is that we don't have to talk about how inspirational it is and how great it is for women. Well, they're racing bikes and we need to be critical of their tactics and critical of different teams, just as we would for men's. That's also an important part of giving it the coverage that it deserves, is criticising it as well. So try and ensure that the treatment is equal where it can be, but also we're aware that historically hasn't been very good coverage of women's cycling. So with things like the women's issue, we're addressing that balance. Something I'm really passionate about, and something that all of the Rouleur staff are passionate about. We've also really grown our female contingent of staff in the last couple of years, make sure that we have, an equal level team of men and women give that input. So changed massively in the last few years, as it should have, and in line with, I think, the general appetite towards women's sport. So yeah, we've really made sure to give that coverage that women's cycling and women's sport deserves.
So the Rouleur women's issue is one not to be missed. When is it available?
So it's available from this Friday, which is the 5th. Yeah, if you subscribe, it'll be the first issue you receive. A couple of days' time after it gets to subscribers, then it will also be available to purchase as a single issue on rouleur.cc. It's a magazine for everyone. You don't have to be a woman to read it. It's just a magazine with stories that do happen to have women at the focus, but there's stuff of interest for everyone in the magazine. And I think, we're really hoping people get behind it. But we know how important representation is. We know the big role that media has to play in that. You have to see it to be it. So we want to make sure that we're doing our bit to show young women that this is a space for them.
Yeah, so true. I will definitely be getting my hands on that. That sounds so exciting. And yeah, just it's for everybody, as you say. It's not just for women, not just for men, and it's not just for the elite cyclists. It's for everybody who is on a bike, which is great. So any
Exactly.
advice for aspiring writers?
I think my biggest advice is be creative. Like, don't copy the style of someone else because you think their writing is good. You really need to find your own style and the way you want to write, and find your own niche, and never go for the obvious thing. Try and look for the hidden angle. Just be creative, have an open mind. If somebody tells you that they, in an interview, that they want to win the world championships, that's interesting, but try and think, well, but what did they say about what they do on their rest day? And who was the last person that they said that they texted on their phone? And try and get those little nuggets of insight about people. Just that gives, it's all about humanity, and trying to get to know people for who they are, and beyond being a sports person. And I think that's probably my advice, is just be creative, and don't be afraid to ask questions. It's the kind of job where you really do have to put yourself out there, and don't be afraid to a race, for example. People are going to say, no, I don't want to be interviewed right now. If you get shouted at by someone, just brush it off, just keep going. Don't be intimidated, basically.
And what would you say are the most common grammar faux pas to avoid?
One thing that really bugs me is when people describe something as aesthetic. When you say, oh, this room is really aesthetic, like, no, it's not. It needs to be a good aesthetic, or a certain aesthetic. It can't just be aesthetic. It's not a description word. That's one thing that really annoys me. But yeah, we have at Rouleur, we've got a whole style guide. You can't put double quote marks in headers. It's about capitalizing world championships, but not world champion. So many things. Try and do your best, but if you've got an editor, then that's their job, so it's fine.
And what are your goals as a journalist looking ahead?
Don't know. That's a difficult one. I think I just want to be part of the movement in women's cycling. I just always want to keep supporting that. I really want to be somebody who I can look back on what I've done and said I made a real difference there, with the coverage I gave it, with the stories I wrote. I got more people interested in the sport. I showed people that women cyclists try just as hard as men. Their racing is just as good. They train just as much. They're just as interesting people, and I really want to be part of something that feels like it's made a difference. So I guess that's my biggest goal, and always trying to improve my writing as well. I mean, reading everywhere I can, reading what other people are writing, reading books. I think that's the key to better writing. It just expands your vocabulary. Just read whenever you can, and you don't realize it, but eventually that really makes a difference in your writing, and it comes through if you've got a kind of varied vocabulary and you know how to structure things that are maybe a bit different or a bit more interesting. You have different techniques, so reading other people's work and books and stuff, that's a really important part, I think.
Yeah, you're giving more tips, a little hidden tip in there. Keep reading.
Yeah.
So we have the women's issue coming from Rouleur in August. What can we expect from them in the long run?
In the long run, well, we've just launched our new app, which we're really putting a lot of focus on, and that is massive immersive experience of Rouleur. I mean, it's got you can listen to the magazine through the audio editions. You can read the magazine online. You can read all of our website coverage, and that's a massive area of growth for us. We really want to keep pushing that, and to get people to be more involved in the Rouleur community. And we're going to be offering, more and more benefits to subscribers, like ride outs, and trying to really build a nice community. So it's not just about reading our articles, it's about being part of a group of like-minded people and getting to know people. And we're doing more and more events, like in the World Championships in Glasgow, we've got events on the men's road race weekend, on the women's road race weekend, where it's about meeting people who have the same interests as you. So I think we really want to try and build the Rouleur community and make it an inviting place for everyone.
Thank you so much for coming on to chat, Rachel. I feel like we've covered so many good topics, and we could definitely delve deeper into them. But yeah, what a sport women's cycling is, and it's so exciting to see how it's going to develop. And yeah, don't forget to check out Rouleur online on the App Store with their new app, and the women's issue, which is coming soon in August. So yeah, thank you so much, Rachel.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was great to chat to you.